Vivian Cross, that arrogant HOA president in a light-colored suit, pointed at me in front of the crowd. "Trash like this has no place in my neighborhood," Ethan shouted. "Hand over the bag. You're not worthy of eating this stuff." They laughed smugly, thinking the cops would humiliate. But when the shining badge came out, the laughter died, because I was Police Commander Marcus Hale. Justice doesn't need noise. It hits abusers of power square in the face. And you, what state are you in? Has your HOA ever dared to disrespect residents like... I remember that morning clearly. The sun was scorched, light flooding every inch of the brick-paved street in the Lakeshore neighborhood. I had just pulled up in front of my house, both hands holding grocery bags that still carried the scent of freshly baked bread and roasted coffee. Something so small might seem trivial to others, but to me, it meant everything. It was peace at the end of the day, proof that even after working late, I still made time to shop so my daughter wouldn't have to eat rushed meals from a fast food joint. But that peace was ripped apart in an instant. Flash of red darted into the pathway. Ethan, the son of HOA President Vivian Cross, stormed out with a face so flushed he looked ready to devour me. He jabbed a finger at the bag and screamed, his voice thick with the entitlement of someone spoiled beyond repair. "Give it all to me. That stuff is mine." His shrill tone was sharp enough to crack the stillness. A few neighboring doors creaked open slightly, residents peeking out, but no one dared to interfere. I gripped the bag handles tighter, feeling sweat pool in my palm. Rage surged, but I kept my voice calm, each word cutting like a blade. "This is the result of my hard work. You have no right." I didn't lower my tone to keep the peace, didn't tremble to avoid conflict. I was used to condescending stares, but having a kid try to snatch my groceries in broad daylight, backed by his family name, felt like spitting on my dignity. Before I could even finish my sentence, a figure stepped through the iron gate. HOA President Vivian Cross, clad in a light-colored suit and clicking heels against the brick, emerged. Her face was meticulously made up, lip curled into a smug smile. She lifted her chin, scanning the lurking neighbors before locking eyes with me. "Here in Lakeshore, we choose who belong. Who do you think you are standing there?" Her words dragged out, each syllable a verdict passed on my existence. Ethan stood behind her, chest puffed, his eyes gleaming with the certainty of victory. I stared at the two of them, silent for a few seconds to suppress my fury. I had seen enough of power-hungry people in my career, from arrogant politicians to criminals convinced that money could buy everything. But the way Vivian wore that pale suit and stood in the middle of the street like some self-declared queen reeked of that special kind of suffocation found only in people who believe HOA rules outrank the law itself. I spoke slowly, each word landing hard in the silence gripping the crowd. "I live here, and I have every right to stand in front of my own house with what I bought." My tone wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight for a few cracked doors to open a little wider, curious eyes to appear. Vivian let out a dry chuckle, shaking her head. "You don't get it. Lakeshore isn't a place where just anyone can show up. We decide who fits, who doesn't, and clearly, you don't." I could hear a few neighbors exhale sharp, fearful, uneasy. Someone pulled back into their home quickly, while others lingered, watching as if waiting for something to unfold. Ethan took another step forward, voice shrieking. "Did you hear that? This is our land. If you hand it over now, maybe my mom will let you go." I clenched the bag handles and took a deep breath. The arrogance of a boy who had been born into the belief that he stood above others, paired with the smug gaze of his mother, the HOA president, made the vein in my temple pulse visibly. I let out a dry laugh, the kind that made Ethan hesitate for a split second. "What I hate most," I said, locking eyes with him, "is running into people who think that just because they live behind a gated street, wear shiny suits, and yell loud enough, they can rob someone in broad daylight." I turned to Vivian. "If you believe your words matter more than the truth, then you're wrong. No one here has the right to steal someone else's effort, not even you." Vivian's expression shifted instantly. Her eyes flashed with fury, the kind that comes from being hit right where it hurts. Ethan screamed, his voice cracking with rage. "You dare disrespect my mom?" He lunged forward, but Vivian grabbed him back. She didn't want to lose face, so she switched tactic, reaching for her phone, dialing, and yelling into the speaker. "There's a black man stealing in Lakeshore. Get someone here now to arrest him." Her words echoed down the street. Neighbors went pale. I heard the murmurs. "Again, she's going to make a scene." I didn't snatch the phone or shout in defense. I just looked at her, a look that made her pride falter for a moment. But then Vivian fixed her hair and gave a cold, sharp laugh. "You think you can win against me? I'm the HOA president. You're just someone making this neighborhood look bad." I didn't respond. I knew, From the moment she made that call, she had walked straight into a trap she never saw coming. Abusers of power never realize that the higher they push the drama, the clearer their true nature becomes. And once the truth comes out, the title of HOA president protects no one. A distant wail of sirens grew louder, red and blue lights starting to flicker at the end of the block. Ethan laughed, shrill and triumphant. "It's over! You're getting dragged away." Vivian raised her chin even higher, shooting glances at the neighbors as if already basking in victory. I picked up the grocery bag and set it neatly to the side, eyes never leaving the mother and son. In that moment, I felt every year of experience build toward this exact point. All the encounters with thugs and corrupt officials had led here. Vivian thought she could weaponize the police, turn me into a criminal. Ethan thought yelling would be enough to take what was mine, but they didn't know the truth was ready to erupt, and they had chosen the wrong target. I muttered under my breath, just loud enough for myself to hear, "All right then, let's see who really gets humiliated this time." And so, I stood there, steady beneath the flashing lights drawing closer, waiting for this neighborhood story to enter an entirely new chapter. Vivian didn't hesitate. Fingers dialed the familiar number, and her shrill voice rang out through the quiet street. "There's a black man stealing. Get someone here to arrest him now." Every word landed like a blade, sharp and vicious, crafted to turn me from a man returning from the market into a criminal standing at the entrance of his own home. I could hear every breath she took, thick with satisfaction, her eyes gleaming at the fantasy of seeing me handcuffed in front of the entire neighborhood. I kept my gaze steady, raised no voice, took no step back. I answered clearly, each word deliberate. "You're lying, blatantly, in broad daylight." My tone carried just enough for a few tightly shut doors to open wider. Eyes peeked out, filled with discomfort but still laced with fear. I didn't need to shout, because every word forced the witnesses to face what was really happening. She was fabricating a scene, using the same tact she'd used before to humiliate others. Vivian lifted her chin, her stance full of defiance. "Here, my word is law, and you're nothing but a parasite ruining this neighborhood." Her voice sounded like a final verdict, one that required no evidence, no truth. Ethan stood beside her, laughing with a high-pitched squeal, eager to add, "See, my mom says it, and you've got no way out." He looked gleeful, like I had already become the neighborhood's punchline. Around us, a few neighbors shook their head, their disgust plain, but none of them spoke up. They knew too well the power Vivian held in the HOA. She had handed out fines for no reason, threatened residents with vague regulations, and scared everyone into silence rather than defiance. That fear was written in every turned back, every pair of eyes that avoided mine. I drew a long breath, trying to suppress the anger that rose as I watched a woman twist truth using cheap power. The kind of power you flaunt is nothing but a farce, I thought, and you'll learn that soon. I'd met too many people who declared themselves the law, and I knew what they all had in common. They believed others would stay quiet, would bow their head. Vivian was no different, except this time, she was pulling her tricks in the place I called home. I locked eyes with her and gave a cold smile. "Your word is not law," I said slowly. "And the law doesn't change just because you're wearing a light-colored suit." My voice was loud enough for the crowd to hear, and I caught a few startled expressions, a few faint smiles from those who found some brief comfort in my word. Vivian, on the other hand, was trembling at the lip, trying to hide it with a smug tilt of the head. Ethan wouldn't stay quiet. He pointed a finger straight at me. "You think you're better than my mom? You're just an outsider here. Don't think living in this neighborhood makes you equal." His voice dripped with contempt, the kind born from Vivian's own pride. I glanced at him once. No words needed. The less I said, the more it burned. In that moment, Vivian's voice still echoed through the phone. She kept adding details to her story, all while repeatedly emphasizing her role as HOA president. She clearly believed the police would take her word without question, that they'd rush over to witness the performance she had scripted under the guise of restoring order. I stood still, watching the smugness on their faces, and a clear thought rose in me. If they believed I would stay silent, they were about to face a truth far greater than the fear they had been spreading. All around, the atmosphere grew heavier. Everyone was waiting for what would happen next. Behind a window, an elderly woman murmured just loud enough for me to hear, "All these years, still the same old game." That small sentence rang out like a sigh for the entire community, a place where people had grown used to being ruled by a woman who believed her power was absolute. I picked up the grocery bag and placed it by straightening my back as I faced Vivian. "You've called the police," I said quietly but clearly, "so let them come, and when they do, you'll understand how heavy your lie really is." Vivian laughed. a smug, condescending laugh, then turned to Ethan. "You see, son? People like that only know how to stand still and wait to be dealt with. We're used to handling those who think they're our equals." Ethan burst into high-pitched laughter, the sound piercing through the already stifling air like needles. I said nothing more, just stood there, calm as if I were the one controlling the entire scene. Inside, I felt a deep certainty. In just a few more minutes, Vivian's charade would collapse, and everyone who had been avoiding confrontation would see her lose the hollow authority she had used to this neighborhood so many years. I glanced around, catching the wary eyes of some neighbors. Some frowned, others pressed their lips tight, as if waiting for someone strong enough to stop the reign of intimidation. I understood them. I had once stood in their place, watching injustice and thinking silence was the safest option. But today, that silence would end. Vivian had dug her own grave by turning lies into weapons, and she didn't realize she was about to be buried by them. I adjusted my stance, arms folded across my chest, eyes locked on the mother and son. They might believe the police would shield them, that the sirens nearing would deliver their victory. Deep down, I knew that once the police car pulled up, truth would no longer be in her hand, and I waited for that moment, like someone waiting for the signal to flip the entire board. The crowd began to stir. A few people discreetly pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Vivian noticed and raised her chin even higher, her voice tightening. "Go ahead, court it. Let the whole neighborhood see how a freeloader finally gets what he deserves." She believed she had won, that this was all just a stage to reaffirm her untouchable HOA power. I let the corner of my mouth curl into a faint smile, eyes steady, no words needed. Only one thought echoed in my mind: they will never forget today. The wail of sirens pierced through the heavy atmosphere of the street. A patrol car sped in, its flashing red and blue lights casting bursts of color on every house it passed, drawing the attention of every resident in the neighborhood. The car door opened and 2 officers stepped out, their faces stern, eyes scanning the crowd before settling on. Their look betrayed suspicion, as if they had already taken Vivian Cross's venomous words at face value. Ethan rushed forward, pointing directly at me, his high-pitched voice cutting through the air like he had been waiting for this moment all his life. "There, that's him. Arrest him." His voice carried both glee and a desperate hunger for power, as though publicly humiliating me would somehow elevate his family's grip over Lakeshore. I didn't move. I simply bent down and placed the grocery bag neatly on the ground, my eyes calm, unshaken. The crowd held its breath. No one dared to speak. Slowly, I lifted my head and looked directly at the 2 officers approaching. My voice dropped, firm and measured. "Are you sure you really want to arrest your own commander?" Time seemed to freeze. The crowd let out a low gasp, a few mouths opening in shock. Vivian stiffened. I reached into my coat and pulled out a shining badge. The sunlight bounced off the metal, bright and unmistakable. I held it at eye level so no one could miss it, then spoke clearly, every word sharp. "I am Police Commander Marcus Hale." Silence fell over everything. The 2 officers halted, their eyes wide before their postures shifted almost instantly. They stood straighter, responding instinctively. The neighbors watching began whispering among themselves, some covering their mouths to muffle their surprised reactions. Vivian's face drained of color for a split second, but she quickly lifted her chin, trying to mask her panic with defiance. "Don't play games with us," she shouted, her voice cracking. "A black man can't be a police commander. He's faking it. Arrest him right now." Ethan joined in, his voice trembling with fear. "Yeah, she's right. It's fake. He's lying to everyone." I stared directly at the 2 officers. They hesitated, but the way they looked at my badge said it all. They knew it was real. I stepped forward, my eyes locked on Vivian. "You just accused me of impersonating law enforcement in front of actual officers of this city. Do you realize you've just dug your own grave?" One of the officers cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. He turned to Vivian and spoke slowly. "Mrs. Cross, this man is indeed Police Commander Marcus Hale, our direct superior." His words hit like a hammer. The crowd erupted into whispers, and then laughed, held back for too long, finally broke free. Vivian swayed slightly but tried to hold on to her pride. "This can't be," she muttered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "This is a lie. I don't believe it." She looked around, searching for a single sympathetic face, but the neighbors who once feared her were now nodding in satisfaction, their eyes gleaming with delight. I didn't miss the moment. I stepped forward, my voice sharp as a blade. "You think you are the law, that your HOA title gives you the right to smear and fabricate against anyone, but the truth is laid bare right here, and today you're not walking away from it." Ethan backed up a step, eyes darting, his mouth moving, but no words coming out. The 2 officers glanced at each other, then stood at attention in unison. "Commander, awaiting orders." They no longer dared to act on Vivian's word. The entire setup she had built within minutes shattered by a single badge and a single sentence. Vivian kept yelling, but her voice had lost all conviction. "You can't listen to him. "He's an imposter! I'm the president here! My word should count." But her voice now rang hollow. In the crowd, I heard someone whisper, "It's been years since anyone shut her up like..." An older man folded his arms and scoffed. "First time I've seen Mrs. Cross with nothing left but that empty title of..." I returned the badge to my coat, eyes fixed on Vivian. "You just turned yourself into a joke for the entire neighborhood. Justice doesn't stand with the loud or the wealthy. Justice stands with the truth." The crowd stayed silent for a bit. Then a rising wave of murmurs spread. Nods, soft laughs, knowing glances. Ethan hid behind his mother, his face confused and pale. Vivian looked around, but there was no one left to back her up. The once silent neighbors were whispering now, some holding up phones to record the scene. I turned to the officers, my voice steady, commanding, "Document this false accusation immediately. We will proceed by the book." They nodded quickly. One officer pulled out a notepad, his hand slightly trembling. Vivian opened her mouth to protest, but muffled laughter from the neighbors stopped her cold. Every word she'd shouted earlier, every ounce of false pride, crumbled in that instant. I looked straight into her eyes and delivered the final line. "You thought you made the rules here. Now the entire neighborhood knows who really does." Whispers, chuckles, and the hum of recording phones filled the air. The heavy tension from earlier had shifted into a rising swell of satisfaction, a wave breaking free from long-held frustration. Vivian stood speechless, face pale, while Ethan stared at the ground, silent, frozen. Inside me, a quiet certainty echoed. This was only the beginning, and I wouldn't stop until the false shadow of power cast by Vivian Cross and her HOA was erased completely. What about you? Have you ever seen a Vivian-type Karen get shut down like this? Drop your story in the comments. The two officers stood frozen, faces briefly revealing discomfort. When I pulled out the badge, their stern expressions turned unsettled. They looked at each other for a few seconds, then almost instinctively straightened their posture, their heels clicking against the brick ground as formally. Not in front of a regular resident, but before their direct superior. I didn't let the silence linger, my voice through the air, each word landing like a blow against the pavement. "Who sent you here? That woman?" My voice rang clearly, echoing across the street. Open windows trembled from the force, and I saw the tense faces of neighbors peeking out, waiting for a reaction. Vivian Cross froze. She stammered a few words, then suddenly screamed to mask her panic. "He's an imposter. A black man can't be a commander." The sentence shot through the air like a poisoned knife. The crowd stood stunned, a few audible gasps breaking the tension. She wasn't just attacking me, she was publicly insulting an entire force, denying reality in front of the very officers standing there. I stared directly at her, my gaze as cold as ice. My voice dropped low, steady, and weighty. "You just insulted the entire police department and denied the truth in plain sight." I didn't need to raise my voice. It was enough for everyone to hear. With each word, I saw Vivian's shoulders stiffen, face tightening in rage and confusion. The officers grew visibly more uneasy. One swallowed hard, his eyes shifting from me to Vivian, then back to the badge in my hand. The other took a long breath, clearly torn between the call he had responded to and the reality now confronting him. They both knew that a single misstep could cost them their career. Behind his mother, Ethan shouted in a trembling voice, "Don't believe him, Mom. He's lying. He's just trying to scare us." But his voice had lost its edge, replaced with fear he could no longer hide. Vivian still refused to back down. She bit her lip, fists clenched, and screamed to the crowd, "Look at this. It's just a setup to humiliate me. A black man could never hold a commander's rank. I've lived here for decades. I know exactly what kind of people they are." That sentence hit the entire neighborhood like a splash of cold water. Murmurs erupted instantly. A woman whispered to her husband, unable to restrain herself, "She's lost her mind." Saying out loud, "Everyone knows," is wrong. An older man nodded, letting out a scoffing laugh. "Still believes skin color defines rank. What a joke." I didn't need to say more. Vivian had unmasked her. I took one slow step forward, my eyes fixed on the officers standing stiff like statues. "I want it clear," I said firmly. "Who sent you here? Did her call provide enough grounds to bring 2 patrol cars and disrupt this entire neighborhood?" The younger officer responded with a shaky voice. "Mrs. Cross made the call, sir. We were only informed there was a reported theft." He bowed his head, his tone small, like he knew he had just condemned his entire unit. I looked at Vivian. Her eyes flared with madness as she realized everything was slipping out of her control. She thrashed and screamed at me, "You can scare others, but you can't scare me. I'm the HOA president. You think some cheap badge can take me down?" I let out a dry laugh, one that brought silence over the entire street. "The only thing cheap here," I replied, "is the lies and prejudice you're spewing. I don't need to scare anyone. I present the truth, and the truth is always stronger than any HOA title." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, Some snapped photos, others began recording. Vivian trembled more with each passing second, but still clung to the flimsy authority she took such pride in. What she didn't realize was that in this very moment, everything she said was turning into evidence she was handing over to the community with her own mouth. After a long pause, the two officers stood straight, formally turning to face me. "Commander," one of them said clearly, "awaiting your instruction." That word, "commander," hit like a verdict. Eyes in the crowd lit up with a quiet thrill. I gave a slight nod, then glanced at Vivian, my voice hard and deliberate. "You tried to use the police to silence a resident, fabricate a story, and humiliate me. But now the police are standing here to expose the opposite. You just destroyed the very mask you've used to control this neighborhood." Ethan tugged at his mother's sleeve, his face pale. "Mom, stop, please." But Vivian yanked her arm away, still trying to appear defiant, even as her eyes began to glint with despair. I turned to the crowd, raising my voice so all could hear. "Remember this. No HOA title gives anyone the right to stand above the law. And anyone who thinks skin color defines someone's worth has already made themselves contemptible." My words landed heavy, echoed with clarity. Few claps broke out, hesitant first, then gaining strength. Applause rippled through the crowd, eventually overtaking the strained, bitter hisses from Vivian. She stood motionless, her eyes wild, her lips trembling, but no words came. I knew this moment was just the beginning. Vivian had just turned herself into a public embarrassment, while I stood still and let the truth speak for itself. And from this point forward, the balance of power in this neighborhood had begun to tip decisively toward justice. Ethan suddenly stepped forward, his face flushed red, his voice cracking in rage. "My dad donates to the mayor. My mom has power here." He spoke with arrogant confidence, believing money and connections were an impenetrable shield. His words fell heavily, making the already tense atmosphere even thicker. A few neighbors shook their heads, and one scoffed quietly. Ethan's pride, laid bare for all to see, felt like a slap to the face of a community long suppressed by HOA abuse. I didn't stop. Step by step, I walked forward, eyes locked on him and his mother, my gaze slicing through their hollow pride like a blade. I spoke, my voice dropping low, each word hitting the air like a hammer. "The only power you have is the power to humiliate yourself." Ethan froze for half a second, his fury flickering into a visible tremble. He tried to lift his chin, tried to regain the arrogance, but his eyes betrayed the fear spreading within. Vivian, still standing behind him, her hands trembling slightly, refused to back down. She shouted, her voice shrill and breaking, "He's lying to all of you. He can't be real." The words came out like a desperate attempt to cling to the last scraps of power crumbling around her. But the more she yelled, the more her shaking hands gave her away, and the crowd began to look at her not just with disgust, pity. I tilted my head and gave a cold smile. My voice dropped, sharp and cutting. "Worse than slander, you're revealing your hatred for anyone you think is beneath." I didn't need to raise my voice. I just let the words fall, and their effect was immediate. Some in the crowd exchanged glances, others nodded quietly, as if someone had finally voiced the resentment they had buried for years. Ethan shouted again, defiant, "My mom is the HOA president. Whatever she says is right. You're just garbage who got lucky to be standing here." His words echoed, but the gloating had vanished. Now he stood alone. The crowd was no longer silent. A middle-aged man called out from the back, "Yeah? She fined me hundreds of dollars just for painting my door the wrong shade. That's your idea of right?" A woman's voice followed. "She made me tear out my vegetable garden because it didn't fit the aesthetic. But her son leaves garbage bins out on the street for a week and nothing happened." The accusations hit like knives one after another. Vivian stood frozen, face drained of color. Ethan screamed, trying to drown it out. "Shut up. You're nothing compared to us." But his voice was lost in the rising murmurs, sighs, and cold laughter. I looked directly at Vivian. Her eyes were vacant. I said clearly, "This is no longer just about you and me. This is about an entire community watching you abuse your power, discriminate, and trample others. You didn't just insult me, you insulted all of them." The crowd nodded, the once fearful eyes now burning with defiance. The silence that had protected her for so long shattered like glass. Vivian inhaled sharply, trying to salvage what she could. "You might scare me, but I have backing. The mayor, council, whole administration, they all owe me favors." She tried to shout it, but her voice cracked like splintered glass. I took another step forward, forcing her to step back. "You can flaunt every connection, every dollar, but you can't buy the truth. And now this entire neighborhood has seen your real face. From now on, every word you speak will be nothing more than the echo of someone whose time is over." Scattered applause broke out, then grew louder. A dry, bitter laugh rippled from the crowd, and Vivian nearly collapsed. Ethan clutched at his mother's sleeve, but even he couldn't lift his head to meet the eyes around him. Those who had once been silenced by the HOA were finally beginning to find their voices again. I stood among them, No shouting, no grand declarations. The truth was speaking for itself through the reaction of the residents, and I knew that Vivian's desperate escalation today wasn't a sign of power. It was the signal of a collapse that could no longer be stopped. She could scream louder, Ethan could shout harder, but neither had ground to stand on. Because once a community stops fearing you, all that false authority becomes nothing but noise. And in this moment, for the first time in years, I saw the eyes of the people of Lakeshore lit with a belief they were no longer alone. I pulled the radio from my hip and held it high for everyone to see. My voice rang out, each word firm, leaving no room for doubt. Cord everything. Open a case for defamation, racial discrimination, and public disorder. The command was issued, clear, direct, like a blade slicing through the mask Vivian Cross had worn for far too long. The two officers paused briefly, then nodded in unison. There was no more hesitation, no more glancing to the HOA president for guidance. Instead, they turned toward Vivian with decisive movement, triggering murmurs in the crowd. Eyes lit up with anticipation, as if justice had finally arrived. Vivian went pale, her lips trembling. She screamed, her voice sharp and cracking, "How dare you touch me? I'm the HOA president. I make the rules here." Her words rang with desperation, the empty pride now reduced to the shrieks of someone watching a fake throne crumble beneath her feet. I looked straight at her, my voice measured, with no wasted words. "Wrong. This is no longer your HOA. This is the law." That moment erupted. The murmuring crowd burst into cheers, then applause, loud, sustained. Those who once stayed silent, who had bowed their heads, now couldn't hold back their satisfaction. Laughter, chatter, and disbelief crashed down on Vivian, cornering her in shame she had never known. Ethan had fully retreated, his wide eyes filled with panic. He had never seen his mother like. For years, he had watched strut through the neighborhood, throwing down regulation, crush neighbors, feeding off the fear people showed. But now that image shattered before him. Vivian still fought back, screaming into the void, "You'll all regret this. I have connections. I have money. I'll drag this whole place down with me." But her voice cracked beyond repair. Her threats now sounded distorted, meaningless. Each word only deepened the contempt around her. A neighbor let out a dry laugh, loud enough for all to hear. "Your connections won't save you now." The laughter spread, swallowing her in mockery. I turned to the officers, my voice cold and direct. "Log everything. This isn't the first time she's used her HOA position to twist the truth, but today, the community will see. No one stands above the law." They nodded quickly, their movements sharper than when they first arrived. They understood too. This moment would be recorded in report, in files, and in the memory of every person on this street. Vivian trembled but refused to back down. She screamed until her voice cracked. "This is my land. This is my neighborhood. You can't do this to me." But the more she screamed, the more the truth came through. Her power had never been the law. It was fear, and fear alone, that she had weaponized to rule. And when that fear disappeared, her throne was nothing but a pile of shrill, broken noise. An elderly woman stepped out from the crowd, her voice trembling but steady. "For years, she's forced us to live in silence. Today, I see the light." Crowd echoed her words, one by one stepping forward to share their story. Some fined for hanging flags in front of their home, some forced to tear down their vegetable gardens, others threatened with ridiculous fee. The accusations piled up, loud and clear, forming a living indictment right in front of Vivian. I stood quietly and listened, letting the voice of the community rise on its own. I knew retaliation didn't come from shouting or flexing authority. The greatest retaliation was this moment, when the entire neighborhood stood as one and exposed her, turning the HOA president from a figure of power into a defendant in a public square. Ethan tugged at his mother's sleeve, trembling, whispering, "Mom, stop it. That's enough." But Vivian yanked her arm away, like someone drowning, still trying to fight. She screamed, "You think I've lost? I'll be back. I'll take everything back." But her flailing no longer scared anyone. The crowd only watched her with scorn, their laughter growing louder. I stepped forward, stopping just a few paces from her. "You ruled through fear, but today, all you're left with is shame. And no one in this neighborhood wants to live another day under your shadow." I turned to the crowd. "From now on, Lakeshore will no longer be a stage for someone who crowned herself the law. This will be a place of truth and justice." Cheers broke out. Hands rose into the air. Faces lit up joy. A middle-aged man shouted, "That's right! It's time to end the era of Vivian Cross." His His words struck like a match, sparking a unified chant. "End it! End it!" Vivian screamed one last time, her voice hoarse, but it was drowned out by the overwhelming chorus. The two officers continued writing, their recorder still running, capturing every word, every sound, every piece of irrefutable evidence. I lowered the radio and looked straight at Vivian. In my eyes, she was no longer the arrogant HOA president. She was simply a defeated flailing in front of the people she once ruled. I knew from this moment on, the law would take care of the rest. I didn't need to say another word. The truth had already said enough. If you were there, would you have clapped too? Drop your thoughts below. An elderly man with silver hair, who had sat quietly until now, suddenly stood up, his voice booming like a drum. For years, she fined me for hanging a small flag in front of my house. But today, justice finally shows its face. Crowds stirred with emotion. He was a veteran, his hands trembling, but his eyes burned bright. He no longer feared citation, no longer feared threats about property value. For the first time, he spoke openly in public, and his voice carried the weight of relief. A woman stepped forward from the back of the crowd, pointing straight at Vivian, her voice hoarse from shouting, "She made me tear out my vegetable garden because it didn't match her idea of aesthetic. My child cried when our tomato plants disappeared overnight. That garden was our family's effort. Do you remember that?" Angry tears still clung to the corners of her eyes, and the crowd nodded together, finding pieces of their own stories in hers. The wave of accusations quickly spread through the street. A middle-aged man raised his voice. "I was forced to repaint my garage because the color didn't match her palette. I paid all the HOA fees, but one day late mowing the lawn, and I got a notice. Meanwhile, her son's trash bins sat outside all week. No one dared to." Another voice, weak but unwavering, came from an elderly woman leaning on a cane. "She once called me out at a meeting just for planting roses along the fence. She said roses had thorns and weren't fit for a luxury neighborhood. I had to pull them all up and stand there, watching the empty dirt like I had been dignity." Each testimony cut into the image Vivian had built for herself. Once perched high above the rest, she now stood stripped bare by the voices of those she had tried to silence. She tried to keep her composure, but her lips trembled, her eyes darted wildly, and the rising shouts forced her to stumble back. Ethan staggered beside her, trying to shield her with one hand, but even he was surrounded by the echoes of blame. A teenage boy shouted, "You used to mock us at the pool, told us we weren't good enough to sit next to you. Look at you now. Who's the disgrace?" Ethan's face turned crimson. He tried to speak, fight back, but the stream of accusations kept coming, and he couldn't utter a word. I stood there, saying nothing, letting the community speak for itself. I didn't need to issue threats. They were already turning their pain into a public reckoning. Those who had stayed silent were now rising together, and once one voice broke through, no one had a reason to hold back. A young man raised his phone, live streaming, his voice loud and clear. "Everyone's watching. This is proof for the whole city to see how Vivian Cross and her HOA have ruled. We're done accepting it." Cheers broke out in response. Some clapped hard, others embraced their neighbors, like people waking up from a darkness that had lasted for years. Vivian shook her head, trying to push through. "It's all lies. You're just jealous. You want to destroy this neighborhood." But the voices of protest drowned her out. No one was listening anymore. Another elderly man's forward, his voice steady. "We're not jealous. Tired of being walked on, tired of bowing our heads out of fear. Today, we say enough." I noticed the expressions on the officers' faces beginning to shift. First, they hesitated, but soon their faces hardened, as if realizing that these stories weren't just spur-of-the-moment outbursts. They were truths that had built up over years. They kept writing, the recorder still running, capturing every shout, every accusation, locking it all into evidence. I took a step forward and looked over the crowd. "You've endured enough. Today isn't just about me being falsely accused. It's about this entire neighborhood reclaiming its voice. Don't let silence keep empowering those who abuse their authority." Applause erupted, stronger and more unified than ever. Faces that once looked down now lifted with purpose, eyes shining with belief. Vivian stood in the center of it all, small and alone. Her light-colored suit no longer a symbol of power, but a ridiculous costume in the middle of a storm of resistance. Ethan shouted, voice shaking, "You think you've won? My mom will come back. She always wins." But the crowd burst into laughter, sharp and full of contempt. A woman called out, "She lost the moment she called the police to lie. No one's afraid anymore." I looked around and saw unity swelling like a wave that couldn't be stopped, and I knew from this moment on, Vivian hadn't just lost to me. She had lost the entire community she once gripped so tightly. This was the most powerful answer a neighborhood give to someone who believed they stood above everyone everyone else. I stood still, not interrupt, not cutting anyone off. The voices kept rising, one after another like a dam had broken, and the flood of resentment poured out. I stayed silent, letting the community vent. That silence made every story hit harder, because now they weren't speaking for anyone else. They were speaking for themselves, and for the pain they had buried far too long. A woman holding a small child raised her voice, hoarse and raw. She once threatened to bring the authorities just because we left a toy bin on the lawn. My child cried all night thinking he'd done something terrible. She made even the kids afraid to live here. The crowd murmured, some wiping away tears, others shaking their heads in disbelief. A burly man raised his hand, voice choked firm. I almost sold my house to get away from how she treated us, but today, I'm glad I stayed, just to see her finally face the consequences right here. Every word, every voice was like a hammer cracking through the mask of power Vivian clung to. She trembled, but still screamed, "It's all lies! All of it is made up." But the more she shouted, the more bitter laughter echoed around her. The people no longer feared her voice. They had found their own. Years of frustration burst into applause and sharp laughter. Some clapped until their palms turned red. Others threw their heads back, laughing like they were finally free. A young man shouted, "She's not our president anymore." Crowd roared in agreement, like a wave crashing down, sweeping away every last empty threat from Vivian. I looked around and saw it clearly, the light in every eye. This was no longer a crowd silenced by warning notices and hollow threat. This was a community standing tall for the first time, no longer trembling at the name Vivian Cross. And in that exact moment, I understood that truth had prevailed, not through weapons, but through people finally speaking what they had long been forbidden to say. I gave a small nod. No words were needed, because everything was now clearer than any evidence. Vivian slumped, face frozen like stone, but her eyes drift, no trace of arrogance left. The applause still thundered, drowning out Ethan's desperate screams as he tried to shield his mother. But no one listened anymore. All of Lakeshore, at least on that afternoon, freed itself from a fear that had lasted for years. And within me, a certainty rang loud. This was only the beginning, and from this moment on, no one would reclaim power with fear again. I turned to the two officers who were still tensely watching and spoke with firm clarity. "Pull up all security cameras around the neighborhood. I want to review every second from the moment I parked until now." My command rang out, direct and unwavering. They nodded without hesitation and immediately contacted the monitoring center. The crowd fell silent for a moment, tension and anticipation hanging heavy in the already charged air. Moments later, a handheld screen lit up, displaying footage from the gate camera. The entire crowd held its breath. In the video, I appeared clearly, carrying grocery bags from my car. Ethan, in a bright red shirt, rushed at me, arms swinging to grab the bag. I blocked him. The bag strap stretched between us, and within seconds, Vivian appeared, smug, making a phone call right there on the spot. Whispers erupted, a few gasps breaking through the crowd. An elderly woman murmured, "He did run up first." A man clenched his teeth and muttered, "All these years, and now there's finally proof to expose her lies." I slowly stepped forward, eyes fixed on the screen, letting every resident see it for themselves. When the footage showed Ethan pointing at me and Vivian throwing her chin up, shouting into the phone, the street exploded in noise. Those who had stayed silent out of fear now had irrefutable evidence. I lowered my voice, speaking slowly, each word like a hammer on the pavement. Evidence doesn't lie. Only liars fear. The crowd erupted. Applause, shouting, and laughter collided into a wave of outrage and satisfaction. Former victims of the HOA's oppression looked at each other, eyes blazing, as if justice had finally chosen their side. Vivian's face turned pale. She backed toward a stone bench, collapsed onto it, her hand trembling as it gripped the edge. Her eyes were vacant, lips moving without sound. Ethan stood next to her, his face ghostly white, shouting, "It's edited! It's fake! Don't believe it!" But no one listened. Scoffs and curses echoed all around him. A middle-aged man clapped a friend on the shoulder, voice full of glee. All these years she made things up. Now she can see it with her own eyes. That's the truth, and she can't deny it anymore. A woman added, "She always said, 'We uphold standards.' What kind of standard is it when her son tries to steal in front of the whole neighborhood?" I looked at Vivian and said nothing, letting my silence slice through the shattered remains of her pride. She bowed her head, hair disheveled, dark red lipstick smeared by a trembling hand. Ethan looked around, saw the disgust in the neighbor's eyes, and screamed louder, but his voice, hoarse, weak and powerless. One of the officers turned to me, his voice steady. "Commander, the evidence is overwhelming. Would you like us to file a report on the spot?" I nodded calmly. "Do it. Record everything. Let no one ever dare fabricate another lie again." The residents' chatter grew louder, but it was no longer tense. It was triumphant. An old man stood up, tapping his cane against the ground as he laughed aloud. "She's got nothing left to say. I've waited years for this moment." One voice after another turned toward Vivian like a collective sentence. She slumped on the stone bench, lips trembling, her eyes hollow like someone who had lost everything. Ethan said nothing, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. I knew then that this moment marked the end of an era of fear and the beginning of something new, where truth could no longer be twisted by the false power of an HOA president. An older woman raised her voice, shaking with emotion. "She humiliated me in front of my own house, said I didn't belong in Lakeshore. Well now, look who really doesn't belong." Applause followed, mixed with bitter laughter. I stepped back, arms behind my back, letting the crowd keep speaking. They were no longer afraid, no longer hesitant. They shouted, they laughed, they clapped. Every word they spoke was a hammer against the walls of Vivian's power, shattering it by piece. A young man shouted, "She once banned me from letting my elderly mother move in, said it was against the rule. My mother had to live away from her family. I'll never forgive." A young woman pushed forward. "My daughter was publicly shamed by her at the school gate for wearing a floral dress. She said it ruined the image of the community. What's more pathetic than an adult humiliating a child?" The stories poured out like a stream, each one stacking atop the last, building a collective indictment. Vivian curled in on herself, slumped on the bench, both hands gripping her temple. She no longer screamed. She knew no explanation mattered now. I slowly walked up and stopped in front of her. My voice was low but rang clearly through the air. "The evidence has said everything. This isn't an argument anymore. It's the truth, exposed. And this truth won't stop at Lake. It's going to court, to the city, to the people who hold real authority. You may have once believed you were the law, but now you're just a liar with no mask left." Vivian looked up, her eyes bloodshot, lips trembling. She tried to speak, but the roar of the crowd drowned her out. Applause erupted again, rising, sustained. It wasn't applause for me. It was for themselves, for the first time breaking free from enforced silence. I turned to the two officers and nodded. "Finalize everything. This record will be essential for everything she's done." They bowed their heads in acknowledgement, their eyes showing a new level of respect. The air was thick with relief. For the first time in years, the people of Lakeshore felt they had the right to speak and that their voices were protected by the law. I stood quietly, letting the moment etch itself into the collective memory. A community once pushed down had risen, and the woman who spread fear now sat collapsed on a bench, lips quivering, eyes dazed. Vivian Cross, once the self-proclaimed queen of Lakeshore, now had nothing left but the shattered remains of pride crushed under the weight of truth. And from this moment forward, everything she once boasted about had dissolved into the thunderous applause of those she once tried to silence. News of the incident spread faster than any rumor before. Within hours, nearly every household in Lakeshore had heard about it, and many were even watching the video shared from residents' phones. The image of Vivian Cross slumped on the stone bench, lips trembling as she faced undeniable evidence, became the hot topic in every conversation. Those who had long suffered under her rule now saw their chance to rise. Fear no longer lingered. Instead, a wave of anger and determination swept through the neighborhood. Signatures were gathered rapidly, and a petition to remove Vivian from her HOA position circulated at lightning speed. People went door to door, counting the events and calling for support. The answers were nearly unanimous. It's time to end this. Those who had once stayed silent signed without hesitation, as if the pen itself were a weapon breaking years of humiliation. I watched the scene quietly. I didn't need to urge them. Residents were doing the most important work themselves. For the first time in years, they weren't just whispering in the dark, they were turning their voices into action. The petition pages lay open on tables, each new name slamming down like a hammer on Vivian's crumbling throne. Meanwhile, Ethan, the one who triggered the entire chaos, was dragged away in handcuffs. He struggled, shouted, but his voice was a hollow echo against the disgusted murmurs of his neighbors. Some looked at him with contempt, others shook their heads in disappointment. A child raised on indulgence and privilege, finally tasting the consequence. Their remarks cut sharper than any legal sentence, a rejection delivered by the very community Vivian once manipulated. I watched as the officers escorted Ethan to the car. His head hung low, far from the smug boy who once pointed at me with glee. With every step he took, the whispers around him grew heavier, like stones falling one after another. It wasn't just personal humiliation, it was proof that the game had changed. From now on, no one would wield the HOA as a shield to strip others of dignity. dignity and right. Vivian remained frozen, her hollow eyes fixed on the crowd eagerly signing the petition. She knew now that the support she once relied on had crumbled. Those who once feared her, flattered her, now turned their backs publicly. The image of power she had crafted for years fell apart in seconds. She was no longer the formidable president, only a fallen figure cast out by her own community. I knew this wasn't the end. The petition was only the first step. Dismantling the remnants of Vivian's authority would take time. But as I looked at the relieved smiles, the nods of solidarity, it was clear. The foundation of the HOA had started to shake and nothing could stop it any longer. I stood before the crowd, letting the noise settle for a moment. Eyes gathered on me, some filled with fury, others with satisfaction, but all waiting for a definitive word. I allowed the silence to stretch, then said firmly, "No one stands above the law, not even those wearing tailored suits for show." The moment the words rang out, another wave of applause erupted. Many nodded, and someone even exclaimed, "Yes, this is justice." I could see clearly that their agreement wasn't just directed at me. It was an acknowledgement that they had, far too long, allowed a self-appointed woman to impose her version of law on the entire community. Now they had heard the truth with their own ears, seen it with their own eyes, and no one wanted to return to the shadows of fear again. Vivian jerked to her feet from the bench, face contorted with fury, cracked lipstick glaring under the afternoon sun. She screamed, her voice raspy, "You can't do this to me. I'm the one who kept Lakeshore clean and safe. Without me, you'd all have nothing." But her shouts fell flat, swallowed by a sea of people no longer listening. They didn't turn away in fear like before. They turned away in indifference, treating her like a broken speaker that had lost all worth. A middle-aged man scoffed, turning to his friend. "Clean and safe? She was just pocketing all the fine." "Her time's up." A woman chimed in bluntly. "She kept her own bank account full while we suffered for years." The responses, laced with bitter laughter, only made Vivian scream louder in despair. Ethan was no longer by her side to back her up. He had already been taken away by the police. Figure slouched as he was led off and handcuffed. Vivian was now utterly alone, surrounded by collective contempt. Every shout from her only deepened the disgust. No one reached out to help her. No one tried to intervene. I took in the scene, witnessing the shift in the air. This community had once been suffocated, once cowered under a woman in a bright blazer who assumed the right to judge. But now, no one trembled. Every gaze fixed on Vivian was cold, decisive, a silent declaration that her illusion of power had ended. I stepped forward, voice firm. "She can scream herself hoarse, but the law doesn't need volume. Justice only needs truth, and the truth has been revealed." Applause thundered again, louder, more relentless, as if confirming everything. Vivian continued to thrash in despair, but the more she fought, the deeper she sank into the pit of shame she had dug for herself. The crowd kept buzzing, voices rising as they discussed what should happen next. Some said removal from office was enough, but many demanded harsher consequences. A woman called out. She punished unfairly, lied, slandered, and deceived the entire community. Losing her title isn't enough. An elderly man added, "She needs to be taken to court. All those years of abuse of power, those crimes can't be forgiven." The shouts of agreement followed, fierce, resolute. Vivian heard them, her eyes bulging wide as she screamed in desperation. "You'll all pay for this. I won't let anyone get away with it." But her threats were no more than whispers in the wind. No one paused at her words. On the contrary, some people chuckled bitterly, and someone even called out, "We've paid enough. Now it's your turn." I let them speak. Let the shout, the clapping, cries for justice fill the air. I didn't need to interrupt, because justice now didn't rest in my hands alone. It had become the collective voice of an entire community. Vivian could scream until her voice gave out, but the truth was already too clear. She had lost everything, from her HOA chair to the hollow respect she once used to bind her neighbors. Her downfall wasn't a silent collapse, but a public unraveling. There was no longer any space for manipulation, no room for intimidation. The people had seen with their own eyes, spoken with their own mouth, and stood shoulder to shoulder in defiance of the fear she once ruled. She was no longer a figure of authority. She was a warning. And as her voice cracked, swallowed by the noise of the crowd, question no longer was whether she had fallen. It was what came next. Justice wasn't just about removal anymore. It was about accountability. And Vivian Cross, who once believed herself untouchable, now sat drenched in the consequences of her own making. So, what do you think? Should she just be removed from office, or does she belong behind bars? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I bent down and picked up the grocery bag I'd set on the ground when it all began. The handle was tight and heavy in my hand, yet somehow felt lighter than ever. I let out a long breath, allowing the weight of the afternoon's tension to dissolve into the breeze. There was nothing left for me to say, because the truth had spoken for itself, and this entire neighborhood had heard it loud and clear. In that moment, I looked up and caught the eyes staring back at me. For the first time since moving to Lakeshore, I didn't see suspicion or coldness. What I saw was a flicker of faith rekindled after years of pressure. I was no longer the new guy who just moved, but had become a symbol of what they'd all been yearning. Just an elderly woman approached, her voice trembling but firm. "We've waited a long time for this moment. Thank you for showing us she wasn't invincible." I nodded. No need for polite words, because this wasn't about me. It was about the collective strength I'd just witnessed. When fear is gone, unity fills the space it leaves behind. I turned to take in the scene around me, neighbors talking animatedly, hands still passing around recall petitions, phones still recording and live streaming this moment beyond our gate. I understood then that the power of just doesn't lie in how loud you shout, but in the moment truth spreads so clearly that the abuser can no longer hide. Vivian Cross may have believed her HOA title would shield her forever. Today proved that power only exists when a community stays silent. An old man with a cane stood beside me, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "We've been quiet too long. Today you gave us a reason to stand tall again," I replied softly. "No one should bow to lies. The law here is for everyone, no exception." He nodded with quiet pride, and I knew his trust reflected the trust of the entire community. Vivian was still there, staggering beneath the weight of collective scorn, but no one paid her any mind. Her shouting, her threat, had all lost meaning. Ethan was gone, and now it was her turn to face the reality that the era of fear had ended. I didn't need to look back. Her fate would be decided by the law. What mattered was that the residents of Lakeshore had seen for themselves justice is real, and it starts with their own courage. I lifted the grocery bag and stepped across the familiar brick road. Applause still echoed behind me, mixed with laughter and stories finally being released. It was the sound of a neighborhood relearning how to stand tall, no longer shrinking beneath the shadow of self-declared power. A steady belief rose in me. What happened in Lakeshore wouldn't end here. This story would spread, showing other communities that no HOA has the right to become a tool for discrimination and abuse. The greatest lesson of all is this: when one person has the courage to say no, the entire community finds its voice. I stopped in front of my door and smiled faintly when I heard the creak of a neighbor's door opening, followed by a voice calling out, "Commander Hale, come by for a cup of tea sometime, won't you?" I turned and responded with a friendly glance. It was a small change, but a meaningful one. From a cold and distant neighborhood, a new sense of connection had begun to flicker. As I stepped inside, I knew one thing for sure. Vivian Cross had lost everything, and the residents of Lakeshore had reclaimed themselves. And I, Police Commander Marcus Hale, didn't need to declare justice, because justice had already been written in the voice and awakening of this very community. I stood still for a moment, taking in the remnants of the chaos that had just subsided. The echoes of conversation still rippled through the air, but instead of tension or fear, they now carried a sense of satisfaction and belief. Within me, one clear thought rang out. Not a proclamation, just a simple truth. Whatever power the HOA claimed is nothing compared to truth and law. I thought back on all the years I had witnessed people abuse titles to suppress others. Those who wore the mantle of authority often believed their voices could drown out what was right, that arrogance could stand in for justice. But today, in Lakeshore, that delusion was shattered. A woman who declared herself the law was ultimately brought down by the very voices of the community she had once dismissed. The image of Vivian Cross slumped on the stone bench, eyes hollow, remained sharp in my mind. It wasn't just the portrait of a defeated woman, proof of the inevitable fall of any power built on deceit. I didn't need to say more. She had shown, more clearly than I ever could, that everything she had flaunted was an empty shell. I walked on, still carrying the heavy grocery bag, but its weight was nothing compared to the lightness inside me now. The entire neighborhood stood behind me, not trembling, not avoiding each other's eyes. They had found something solid to lean on, something that gave them the courage to speak, and it was they, not I, who would carry this story forward. In their eyes, I was no longer just the new resident down the street, but the one who pulled the curtain back on a lie. They saw something clearly now. Justice isn't some distant idea. It begins the moment someone dares to rise. Every accusation they voiced, every nod of agreement, every name on the recall petition was proof that truth can win when a community stands together. I thought to myself, and this time not just for me, prejudice and arrogance only survive until someone stands up, and today, this entire neighborhood has woken up. It wasn't just an ending, it was the start of something new. Lakeshore would change, because the people had changed. They now understood that fear never protected anyone, and that truth, no matter how late, still holds the power to wipe away every lie. I knew from this point forward no Vivian Cross would ever reign unchecked here again, and that is the final lesson, not just for Lakeshore, but for any community once shackled by arrogance and discrimination. The story at Lakeshore ended in the sound of residents residents' applause and the complete downfall of Vivian Cross. But its echoes didn't stop there. From what seemed like an ordinary afternoon when I was simply carrying groceries home, the entire truth about an abusive, arrogant, and discriminatory HOA system was laid bare. It wasn't just a confrontation between me and a family that did the law. It was a turning point that awakened an entire community, showing them that silence, when prolonged, only feeds injustice. Looking back, everything unfolded in a harsh but necessary sequence. Ethan, pampered since childhood, thought arrogance and shouting could steal the hard-earned effort of others. Vivian Cross, wrapped in her pale-colored suit, believed the title of HOA president was an untouchable shield, that her word was law, and that a few phone calls could turn a victim into a criminal before the eyes of the community. But from that very moment they chose lies and humiliation, they had already taken the first step down the slope of collapse. When the police arrived, many thought I would become a laughingstock for those who called themselves powerful. But with one simple act, pulling out my badge, I turned the game on its head. There was no room for lies once truth came to light. Vivian kept flailing, using her voice to mask her panic, but the louder she yelled, the more her desperation showed. And from the moment I ordered the recording and the case file to be opened, everything shifted. Fabricated power shattered, replaced by the public judgment of the law and the community. The peak wasn't just in my exposing them. It was when the residents of Lakeshore spoke out together. Accusations of unjust fines, years of petty insults, stories of vegetable gardens torn out. People blocked at gates for absurd reasons. Everything converged into a collective indictment. I stayed silent to let them speak, because true justice doesn't live in the hands of one person, but in the unified strength of many. Long-standing resentment erupted into applause, bitter laughter, and more importantly, a shared agreement that the era of fear was over. The moment the security camera exposed the truth, when the entire neighborhood saw Ethan was the one who lunged for the bag, was the death knell for Vivian's authority. She slumped onto a bench, lips trembling, eyes vacant, as if tasting public failure for the first time in her life. The residents, on the other hand, stood taller, stronger, and recall petitions were signed at a record pace. The woman who once thought the world revolved around her now stood cast out by her own community, and her son was taken away in handcuffs under a storm of contemptuous stares. I looked back on the entire sequence, drawing deeper lessons. First, the lesson of truth. In any situation, truth holds more enduring power than shouting or deception. Vivian could manipulate, she could fabricate, but one camera clip, one genuine badge, and most importantly, the collective memory of a united community wiped out everything she tried to conceal. Second, the lesson of silence. For years, the residents of Lakeshore accepted silence out of fear, believing they were alone. That very silence allowed Vivian and her son to grow more arrogant and but when one person dared to stand up, the entire community found a reason to break their chain. Change doesn't come from grand gestures all at once, but from the moment each person dares to raise their voice. Third, the lesson of justice. Justice is not some abstract concept that only exists in the courtroom. It lives in everyday life. Justice shows up when someone dares to say, enough, when people clap in unison to support the truth. Justice in Lakeshore wasn't written through lengthy verdict, but through the collective decision of those who had long been oppressed. And finally, the lesson of unity. One individual, no matter how strong, can hardly change an entire system without solidarity. But a community, once awakened, can topple a false power structure in a single afternoon. Vivian Cross once believed she could stand alone at the top, but the truth proved that no one stands higher than a united crowd. I left the small neighborhood square to the sound of lingering applause, carrying the grocery bag that first had been the excuse that made me a target. Now that very bag had become a symbol of something ordinary but powerful. The everyday life of each resident cannot be stolen by arrogance. I didn't need to be a hero, because justice had revealed itself through the voice of the entire community. The story of Lakeshore will be retold, not because of my presence, but because it stands as proof that injustice cannot last forever. When the truth is exposed, when a community speaks with one voice, any president's seat can fall, and anyone who declares themselves the law will eventually bow their head. And if there's one thing I want to leave behind for anyone who hears this story, it's the belief. Prejudice and disdain only survive until someone stands up. And today, this entire neighborhood woke up. Lakeshore has changed. But more importantly, the people here have changed. They're no longer afraid, no longer bowing their head. They've learned that justice isn't something just begin with them.